Hello everyone and welcome to my SQL Bit session. My name is Paul Andrew. I'm a Principal Consultant, Solution Architect and Microsoft Data Platform MVP. I'm over in the UK, so if you're joining me from abroad, hello. So in this session, we are talking about using Azure DevOps and specifically for Azure Data Factory. So how do we get our Azure Data Factory from our dev environment over here into production over here? And yes, I did set the camera to widescreen just so I could do the arrow thing. And maybe to answer your other most important question, yes, that is a Millennium Falcon up on the shelf above me. Okay, important things out of the way. Let's move on. So, if you like the slides that I'm going to share with you today, you are more than welcome to download them from my GitHub repository. There is one in there called Community Events, and there's a few child folders in there with all of the content from my community sessions, including this one. So feel free to go and get the PDF of the slides if you want them. So let's think about firstly Azure Data Factory, and let's just take a quick overview of this Azure resource before we actually then think about deploying it and delivering it using Azure DevOps. So if we ask the question, what is Azure Data Factory? Well, in the context of this thing, this data that we want to do something with, where we want to get it from A to B to C, Data Factory will sit there as the orchestrator, the umbrella service, if you like, for that process. It will invoke our services and it will allow us to get that data, maybe copying it from our on-premises systems up into our data lake in Azure, maybe transform it, do whatever we want to it. And as I say, orchestrate is the key word here. Data Factory will orchestrate that process for us and help us monitor, schedule, whatever we need to do to get that data to where we need it to be. So if we dive a little deeper into that process and we say, well, what do we build within our data factory to allow that to happen? There are 5 main components that I like to refer to. And these are here, number 1, our link services, the thing that we will use to authenticate, or Data Factory will use to authenticate against the service we're connecting to. Data sets, which will be the metadata representation of the data that we're going to work with. And our data sets will authenticate using our link service connections. Number 3, our activities. So this is information tailored specifically to the service that we're going to go and invoke. So maybe if we're calling a Databricks notebook, we will have a Databricks notebook activity, and it will also authenticate using our link service connections as well. Then number 4, our pipelines. So as you can see in the visual here, I've kind of put this dotted line around maybe the activities that we've got. And the pipeline is just a logical grouping of those activities. And it will allow us to control and put our activities together. We can put many activities within a pipeline, however we want to structure them really. We can call pipelines from other pipelines. And then lastly, number 5, we have this idea of triggers. So a trigger will attach to a pipeline or many pipelines, and it will allow us to, of course, execute the contents of that pipeline or execute the activities that are within that pipeline. So those are our 5 core Data Factory components, as I would call them, the things that we need to achieve this process from A to B to C with our data or whatever we may do. Let's park those 5 components for now, and now let's turn our attention to actually Data Factory DevOps. So let's firstly think about integration. Let's think about our source code, and let's think about when we're actually developing with our Data Factory resource. Now, we don't do this in Visual Studio anymore, unfortunately, with Data Factory, but what our developers can do is connect to the Azure portal and then selecting the Data Factory service we want to work on, we can go into another browser-based interface and we can actually build our Data Factory in a graphical way via a browser. So we do need to be online to do this, but that's fine. So when we're doing this with our Data Factory, what we can then do is connect our Data Factory to our source code repository. And we might use Git for that or GitHub, it doesn't really matter, but hopefully the point here is that our developer can work in their feature branches, they can make changes to Data Factory, and what will happen is, which is something maybe not so common, is that when we hit save within that developer environment, Data Factory behind the scenes will do a commit and a push of any of those changes that you've made. So that's something to be aware of. We will have perhaps some feature branches there, and we will probably go through a pull request and we will merge those features back into our master branch, maybe. Hopefully a fairly common scenario. And all of our developers here can maybe work in their separate branches, or they can work in the same branch, and they will get some debug capabilities. Now, what we can also do is that if we compare that development environment to Visual Studio, which is maybe something that we're more familiar with, we are at this point working in Visual Studio if we like, or working within that Data Factory UI. But what we can also do within Data Factory when we've got that resource that's deployed in Azure, is we can publish. So within our developer UI, there will be a publish button, very much like with a Visual Studio project, we might right click and publish. And what that'll do is it will take our code from our master branch and it will deploy those pipelines, those activities, whatever it may be, to that Data Factory resource that we've got available in Azure. So we kind of get the bit of both there when it comes to that Data Factory user interface. We get the developer experience, and for a single Data Factory, we can, if we want, also publish it. If we were drawing a comparison maybe between that and SSIS, our sys packages, we might develop them in Visual Studio, and we then might publish them to a SQL Server with integration services running on it. Here within that Data Factory, we get both because we're working with platform as a service tech in Azure. So we kind of get the Visual Studio experience and the service that we're going to run experience as well, all in the same place. So that's a little bit about integration, a little bit about source control. Let's turn our attention now to delivery or deploying our Data Factory, because as I've said, we can hit publish from that developer UI and it will deploy those components for us. And what you can obviously see from the visual here is that I've kind of made this distinction between where we have that developer Data Factory or that dev environment and we get that debug capability that comes with it. And if we want, we could say that when we publish, we're publishing to our prod Data Factory if we're using a single Data Factory resource. And what I'm going to say is in the context of deployment and delivery is that I'm going to call that option one. Option one of using a single Data Factory in Azure, and that's all we need. We have no other requirements in our environment for that. We can use a single Data Factory for both development and deployed to production. So option one, probably not the most common scenario. Hopefully we are good developers. We have multiple environments here. So if we want to think about deploying our Data Factory where we have a dev environment, maybe test, maybe prod, whatever you want to call these things, we need to consider option two. Now, for option two, we still maybe start with that same developer environment that was there, but then what we need to do is we need to take the ARM template, or should I say what we could do is take the ARM template from dev, we deploy it to test, and then maybe we deploy it to production as well. So I'm going to call that option two for now, where we're using an ARM template to deploy our data factory to multiple environments. And that's something that we could do. Now, as for achieving that and actually thinking about how do we do that, how do we achieve option 2, because that's probably the most important question at this point. Well, to answer that question of how, I'm going to use option 1 for context, just for now, to try and set the scene. And in option 1, as I've said, we have our data factory resource that our developer is working on. Now, what's important to understand is how do we get that source code from our data factory? We're working with this PASTech in a browser. It's connected to our Git repo, of course, but what source code do we use? So if we say, well, getting our ADF source code, what we could do is from our master branch or our feature branch or whatever, we can access those 5 components that I talked about in the beginning, our link services, datasets, etc. And those JSON artifacts will all appear separately, and we will have one JSON file per link service, per dataset, etc. And those will be available to us, so we can get to them directly from our repo. We could also, if we wanted to, from that developer UI, there'll be a button on the toolbar at the top that says export, and we can export an ARM template from the UI, a manual process that will give us a zip file containing our data factory ARM template with a JSON parameters file for that ARM template, and we could also use that. So we have a second option for our data factory JSON. Now, the dev data factory on my, the prod data factory on my slide here, of course, isn't really applicable anymore. We're thinking now about option 2 with multiple environments. So let's just replace that and let's call that dev. So we have a debug service and we have a dev service. But now in this dev environment, and if we're debugging, would we really publish? Would we really deploy our data factory to the dev resource that's there in Azure? Well, the thing that I want to highlight here is that if we want to get what I'm going to call the correct Azure ARM template, we have to hit that publish button. And what will happen behind the scenes is that publish button will create another branch in our code repo, which is called ADF_publish. Now, what you'll find if you look at that other code branch, you'll get a third set of JSON files, and this one will now be called, I quote, ARM template for factory.json. Now, if we want to automate the delivery and the deployment of our data factory, that is the one that we need to use, and that's the one that we need to focus on for now if we're thinking about that option 2 deployment scenario. So let's stick with it. Let's say we're going to use that ARM template for factory to deploy our data factory between our test and our prod environment. So now let's bring into the picture our tool Azure DevOps. And what we can do in there is maybe build our artifacts. And obviously I use the word build loosely, but that in the context of data factory is publishing that data factory from dev to get that JSON file we need. And depending on your branching strategy, we might need to trigger that, trigger that publish, or trigger when we get a commit to our ADF_publish branch, and we get our data factory artifact, of course. Then in Azure DevOps, we create our releases, which for some reason has the icon of a rocket. It's fine, we can launch the data factory. And I would create a release pipeline, not to be confused, of course, with a data factory pipeline. This is a deployment thing now. And then what we could do is use the Azure Resource Group deployment task. We might give it some parameters to override the content in our ARM template, and we might use some scope variables within our release to do that. Fairly common, hopefully, within an Azure DevOps release process. We trigger that release and we get our test data factory. We then might clone our pipeline. We might set some gates on it. We might change the parameters again. I never let any of my developers deploy to production. I have release gateways there that say, send me an email if they're trying to do this, some approval process maybe. But ultimately, what we can do is we can get our production data factory using those artifacts. Now, that's fine as a basic scenario covering off option 2 with using Azure DevOps to achieve that. We're okay. But, and there is a fairly big but here, if we're doing that ARM template, that ARM template for factory as it's called, it's going to do a wholesale deployment of all 5 of those components that we have within our data factory. Now, we might not want to do that. We might want more of a granular deployment. And the other thing, of course, to be aware of is that by default, that ARM template that we get out of the box, it's only going to parameterize and expose our link service connections. It's not going to give us the option to parameterize all of the other stuff within our data factory, only the link services by default. So what can we do? Well, if we want a more granular deployment, I'm going to say that we can use option 3. So I'm going to introduce option 3 here, and I'm going to say that instead of using the artifact from the ADF_publish branch, I'm going to say let's use the artifacts from our master branch or our feature branch or your release branch, however you want to control it. Those artifacts where we have one JSON file per component within our data factory. What we can then do maybe with option 3 is instead of using those ARM template deployment tasks, we can use PowerShell. And for each of those artifacts, for each of those component types, we can align them to the respective PowerShell commandlet. And we can use that one that one component within our data factory as the definition file for its respective PowerShell commandlet and do a deployment that way instead. So that gives us much more control over our data factory artifacts that we want to deploy. So I'm calling this option 3. And of course, we can pass some parameters to that. We can control it. We can override things in those JSON files as we see fit. But there are some caveats to be aware of. If we're going to go with option 3, we need to think about maybe dependencies. We, of course, can't deploy a data set that has a link service that needs to go before it to authenticate. So we need to handle dependencies ourselves. We also maybe need to handle removals. So the set commandlet in PowerShell, it's only going to add our data factory components. If we need to remove things as part of our deployment process, we might need to think about handling that as well. So there is actually another option we can consider here. So this was option 3. What I'm now going to introduce is option 4. And what option 4 is, it's the same concept of using PowerShell, but what now my friend Camille has done is he's wrapped up those PowerShell commandlets into a module. And within Camille's module, those caveats that I talked about with option 3 go away. We can use our granular artifacts within our data factory to do the deployment using PowerShell. But Camille has handled the dependencies for us. We can supply it with the configuration information, and it does all of the things that we need it to do. We can, if we like, go one step further as well, and there is now a custom task. I believe it's still in preview, but a custom task available within the Azure DevOps marketplace to do this publish of Data Factory, giving us this granular control so we don't need to use the ARM template. So that's option 4 as well, kind of building on option 3, just to bear in mind, you might want to explore that. So let's just summarize. Option 1, deploying Data Factory with a single service. Option 2, maybe we've got multiple data factories, multiple environments, and we might want to use the ARM templates to do that. Fine, you can do that. Option 3 is using the PowerShell commandlets for each of the Data Factory artifacts to give you that more granular control. A few caveats to bear in mind, but it's an option. And then option 4, using the PowerShell module, which kind of wraps up the commandlets of option 3. And there's also a marketplace DevOps task available for you as well if you want to do that. So what I've tried to do is trying to distill that Data Factory DevOps story for you and summarize that into just a set of questions that you might want to ask yourself if you're doing this. I've obviously shown you a few different approaches, but you need to think about what is your branching strategy, what source code tool are you going to use, how many Data Factory environments are you going to have, and how are you perhaps going to handle that debug environment versus dev versus whatever else may come after it. The deployment method, either with those artifacts that I showed you against your master branch or maybe the ARM template, you need to decide. And then given those artifacts, what method you're going to use. You could use PowerShell for the ARM template as well if you wish. So some things to think about and hopefully summarize nicely in this slide. And with that, that's it from me, folks. So thank you very much for listening to the session. As mentioned, do feel free to get the slides out of my GitHub repo. They'll be up there very shortly. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.